I think Murray Rothbard once said that criticism of the mainstream that they have physics envy, that
Physical, yeah.
they want to make economics like physics or chemistry now. And Murray said that in the hard sciences, that's the way to go. You have a hypothesis and you test it, and if it's empirically can't be demonstrated, well, then we have to be very suspicious of it. Whereas Austrian economics, we diverge in many ways. The only good macroeconomics is microeconomics.
This edifice of modern economics that is a kind of dualistic about macro, that is not convincing, and the only convincing paradigm that I discovered meanwhile that heals that fills this gap or overcomes this dichotomy as this marginalist subjectivist theory that we nowadays call Austrian. Although back in the day, Walter knows that better than me. It was called simple economics.
Okay, I'll start.
Okay, you'll start. Go ahead.
Austrian economics is the field that I specialize in. I'm Walter Block. I'm a professor at SMC. And a lot of people think that Austrian economics has got something to do with the country Austria. Not really. The reason it's called Austrian economics is because the people who started it, who founded it, were all just happened to be in Austria. Menger, Bombewerk, Hayek, Mises, they all were in Austria, so it's called Austrian economics. It's very similar to Chicago economics. Well, I shouldn't say that because there are differences, but Chicago economics has got nothing to do with the city Chicago. Similarly, rather, it's because Friedman and Stigler and Becker were all in Chicago, so that it's called Chicago economics. But so this is a common confusion that a lot of people make. The way I see the battlefield, the intellectual battlefield, there are three free enterprise schools of thought: Austrian economics, public choice, and Chicago economics. And the rest of it is and by the way, Chicago and public choice are part of the mainstream, whereas Austrianism really is not part of the mainstream, but they are free enterprise, sort of. Austrian is more so. As for the rest of the profession, they're Keynesians. And I'll end my opening by saying that Milton Friedman once said that we're all Keynesians now. Well, put it this way, Austrians are not Keynesians.
Yeah, you. By the way, I'm Ivan Jankovic, also professor at SMC, and Walter and I, we agree. We disagree about certain things in policy, but we mostly agree about the theoretical, methodological issues. And something that Walter just said is interesting. Famous. I don't know if this was apocryphal or real. When Milton Friedman said, "We are all Keynesians now," it's real. So
Yeah.
I give just my brief interpretation of that saying, which kind of encapsulates the differences between the Austrian and the mainstream Chicago approach in economics. What Friedman meant by that is not that everybody agrees with the Keynesian policy prescriptions and economic philosophy, big government, and we need the fiscal policy programs when recession hits and so on. He meant something rather different, that in how the mainstream economists, whether they're Keynesians on the left side or monetarists, Chicago guys, and even public choicers, I would say to some degree, understand the methodological approach to economics is similar. This is the macro approach, this idea of trying, on the one hand, macro approach, dealing with the big aggregates like unemployment, inflation, public debt, and so on, trying to explain the economic life by invoking that. And another thing is this attempt to emulate the method of natural science in studying the economic phenomena. So I would say that's something that they disagree in the mainstream economists disagree in their final conclusions, whether they're policy conclusions or philosophical conclusions, but they more or less agree in how they approach the methodology of economic science. And that's more or less an attempt to emulate what physics, chemistry, or other natural sciences are doing. They consider the approach that used by Austrians, which is more a kind of philosophical deductive approach based on reasoning rather than on empirical testing. They consider that to be unscientific or dogmatic or theological and so on. And for me, that's one of the most significant differences, that Austrian economics is more about the main job that you have to do is to understand the connection between individual phenomena that you already know a lot about empirically, rather than to go out in the world and to test the phenomena. So Hayek once said, I don't remember whether that was in his Nobel Prize speech or somewhere else, says that in economics is much more, it's not so important to test again and again the same theories, but rather to develop, to provide enough empirical evidence for the already given theories, but rather to invent enough new theoretical explanations to explain what we already know, actually. And that's the main difference. That's the main difference, that the mainstream economics essentially starts from hypothesis, hypothetical deductive methods, hypothesis and hypothesis testing, whereas in Austrian, Walter will say a little bit more probably about that, how this Austrian method functions. How can you have a science which is not based on empirical validation or empirical falsification?
Right. I think Murray Rothbard once said that criticism of the mainstream, that they have physics envy.
Physics envy, yeah.
They want to make economics like physics or chemistry now, and Murray said that in the hard sciences, that's the way to go. You have a hypothesis and you test it, and if it's empirically can't be demonstrated, well, then we have to be very suspicious of it. Whereas Austrian economics, we diverge in many ways from the mainstream. We diverge on cardinal and ordinal utility. We believe in ordinal utility. I like, I don't know, I like this pen more than this cough drop. Yeah. That's okay. Or I like vanilla ice cream more than.
Do you like it 6.2 times more or 5.3? That's what I'm interested in.
That's the point, that they believe in cardinal or counting utility, that this is 10 utils and this is 5 utils, and therefore I like this twice as much as that. And we Austrians say, forget about it. That's nonsense. There ain't no such thing as utils. And when you put utility on a vertical axis, you're in cardinal utility because you're counting utils. We disagree on monopoly theory. We disagree on business cycle theory. We disagree on many things. But to me, the most important, the quintessential thing of Austrian economics is none of those things, although those are important things. But the main thing to me is the methodology. Now, the way I understand that, there are 3 types of sentences. One type of sentence is a tautology. And a tautology is necessarily true, and you can't test that. And even the mainstream with physics envy don't deny that. For example, bachelors or unmarried man. You don't go up to a bachelor and say, are you married? If he's a bachelor, he's not married. And the essence of a tautology is it tells you it's absolutely true, but it tells you nothing about the real world. It just tells you how you're using language. H2O makes water. Not necessarily. I mean, it could be H3O or H1O. I don't know. There's no necessity. But we Austrians believe that there are certain things that are absolutely necessarily true and tell us about the real world. For example, I bought this pen for $1. When I bought this pen for $1, how much did I value the pen at? Not 90 cents, otherwise I would have lost money. Not even $1, in which case why would I bestir myself to buy the pen for $1 if I only valued it at $1? There'd be no profit in it for me. I must have valued it at more, maybe $1.25. So I made a 25 cent profit. And we Austrians say that this is necessarily true. If you understand the English language, you understand that voluntary trade is mutually beneficial, at least ex ante. Now, ex post, I might regret this, but ex ante, necessarily true, absolutely.
Yeah, I agree. If I may add one additional point here is that one of the peculiarities or one of the specific features of Austrian economics in modern economic tradition is that it rejects this micro-macro split in economics. Or to be more precise, actually claims that macroeconomics doesn't exist, strictly speaking, that you have to derive the entire body of economic theory starting from these initial theorems or axioms about human choice, the exchange, marginal utility, and so on. And one of the most frustrating things that maybe was one of the motivations for you and I to write our introductory textbook in economics was that the mainstream economists very often start well with this introductory chapters about marginal utility and exchange and subjectivism, subjective theory of value, subjective utility. They would mostly reject cardinal utility and this entire pre-neoclassical approach. And then in the next chapter, they expressly forget about all of that and start talking about externalities or optimal taxation and stuff that simply assumes that what you said in the first chapter is not correct or is not the whole story. So the details how you develop a complete quote unquote macroeconomic theory about the monetary system and the business cycle is a complicated thing. It's not easy, but for starters, you should read probably The Theory of Money and Credit by Ludwig von Mises. Is a good place to start, how to show the connection between individual choice, marginal utility, and money macroeconomic phenomenon, how you can derive that concept by starting from individual choices of individual human beings. Actually, and for me, that's the most significant ambition of Austrian economics, is to be faithful to what Hayek said once, again, that every progress in economic theory in the last 100 or 150 years was a step forward towards greater subjectivism. In a certain sense, it's a reductionism in economic theory, that you have whatever you say in economics, in whichever field or subfield of economics, has to be eventually in some way reducible to the talk on individual human beings and their preferences, choices, and exchanges. And that's the key, or one of the keys for Austrian economics, and that's why it was always a convincing approach to me. Not so much, people very often come to Austrian economics from these policy preferences or philosophical views or libertarianism or whatever. For me, it was actually from a philosophical level that I saw that this edifice of modern economics, that is a kind of dualistic about macro, that is not convincing, and the only convincing paradigm that I discovered meanwhile that heals that fills this gap or overcomes this dichotomy as this marginalist subjectivist theory that we nowadays call Austrian. Although back in the day, Walter knows that better than me, it was called simple economics. 100 years, 150 years ago, most people approached economics in this way, before this counter-revolution where technological and engineering and physics envy overcome the economic science.
A good short summary of what you just said. Excellent presentation. Is the only good macroeconomics is microeconomics. That would be a very shorthand way and
short summary. Yeah,